All right. Hello, everyone. So, we are now live with our new series of Carbon Experts Live. Welcome, everyone. Hey, today's session is going to be decarbonizing the built environment. What's driving progress in embodied carbon reduction? What an exciting topic. And today we have Anthony Pak joining the conversation with us. And thank you, everyone, joining online. That's fantastic to see so many people dialing in. I can see Travis is excited there as well. Before we get started, can I kindly ask everyone to go in the chat or comments box and type where you're calling in today? Would be great to see how we have attendees all over the world. So go into the chat, comment section, and type which country you are calling in from today. And while we wait everyone to share their location, let me briefly share who we are and what to expect today. So this is Carbon Experts Live. It's hosted by One Click LCA. It's our monthly conversation series about low carbon construction. My colleague Travis is hosting this series together with me. And each of these sessions, we will feature some exciting expert guests. And today, like I said, we will have Anthony joining us, and we'll get to introduce him shortly. And I'm Jenny. Great to meet you, everyone. And I'm actually joining from our marketing team side, and I'm based in Finland, in Helsinki. It's a lovely sunny evening here. And Travis, is it morning for you, right? And where are you joining from today?
It is. I'm actually in Vancouver right now, so it's 8 in the morning for us.
All right, early bird. How about Anthony? Where are you today?
Same, Vancouver.
All righty. Did you get your morning coffee already?
Right here, ready to go.
Fantastic. All right, so we can see we have attendees from many, many places already. So we have from Portugal, Germany, Ireland, Poland, Canada, US, New York, Texas mentioned, Vancouver, Moana, Toronto. We have Saudi Arabia. We have another one from UK, Zurich. Oh my God, there's so many coming in. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining today. So thanks again for taking the moment to join in the conversation. So what to expect? So let's cover a little bit of a housekeeping rules. So you can post questions anytime, comments anytime during the session, but we will start first by having a nice conversation with Anthony. We will ask some questions when it comes to driving successful embodied carbon reduction. But then we'll take your questions. So we will have a live Q&A. And for this, I'm going to kindly ask you to submit the questions already during the conversation. So please go into the comments, chat, or questions box. It doesn't matter where you type your questions. We'll pick up those questions in the middle part of this session. And then at the end, we have prepared some questions for Anthony. So we'll get to answer those at the very beginning. And that's all for my side. Travis and Anthony, are you ready to get started?
Yeah.
Yes, we are. I think so. Yeah. I guess I'll take over from here. So again, just seconding what Jenny just mentioned. Welcome everybody. This is our second episode of Carbon Experts Live. We're talking to Anthony Pak today about decarbonizing the built environment, and we're asking him about some LCA practices and policies, and just delving into some of his experience in both of these areas. Just a quick introduction about Anthony. He is the founding principal of Preopta, which is a firm with experience in life cycle assessments for buildings. Preopta supports design teams in Canada, and well, you can expand on this, Anthony. It might be beyond Canada as well, in the decision-making process around embodied carbon in their projects. Preopta also works with leading jurisdictions such as the City of Vancouver, the province of BC, and the Canadian federal government to help develop effective embodied carbon policies. They also work with forward-thinking owners and developers to help reduce embodied carbon across their project portfolios. Anthony's also a busy guy. He's also the founder of CLF, the Carbon Leadership Forum in British Columbia. formerly the CLF of Vancouver. And since 2019, the CLF of BC has inspired 30 other cities to start local CLF hubs, which is fantastic. We've got one in Alberta as well, where I generally live. And he's now serving as the global hub director and working to support the growth of additional hubs around the world. So leaving it here, welcome, Anthony. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. So I guess just kicking off, a couple of quick questions. We can talk about, we've given kind of the professional background of you, but from a personal perspective, what kind of drove you? What got you started as a construction carbon expert in LCA?
That's a good question. Well, I guess so. I actually started off working in the mechanical engineering domain. So I used to kind of design HVAC systems and plumbing systems and whatnot. And I actually did my master's program in Norway in a field called industrial ecology, which is when I first learned about life cycle assessments. And when I came back to North America after my master's, I was trying to talk to people about LCA and buildings, and basically nobody really cared for a couple of years until it started kind of getting incorporated into LEED and into City of Vancouver's rezoning requirements. But broadly speaking, what drives me is looking at blind spots, right? Like looking at what are those areas that we're currently ignoring, but actually are really big, impactful areas. And so I think embodied carbon is definitely one of those domains. I've given many presentations, which I oftentimes refer to embodied carbon as the blind spot of the building industry. But I find it particularly interesting because it's kind of a relatively new area for the industry. But even within that topic, there's so many kind of unexplored areas or domains, things that are kind of blind spots within the blind spot. So I just find the work interesting and also impactful in that sense.
Really cool. You mentioned you were in Norway. I lived in Norway for a while as well. Whereabouts
awesome.
were you?
In Trondheim.
Trondheim. Okay, way up north.
Yeah.
Okay, I was in Oslo.
Yeah.
No,
Nice.
Yeah, we'll have to talk
Beautiful
about
country.
that offline one day. Yeah, it's great.
Yes.
So if we were reading on your website that, and this kind of ties into what you were just mentioning, that if you design buildings without considering embodied carbon, you're missing half the equation. Can you expand on that a little bit and just describe what you mean by that?
So, I mean, I think the green building industry historically has had a lot of strong focus on operational carbon emissions, right? How do we reduce the energy use in buildings? How do we reduce the heating demand or cooling demand? And how do we kind of supply it with more renewable energy? So the operational carbon domain is like an area that there has deserved most of the focus and has had a lot of focus. Embodied carbon is kind of the other half of the equation. Like if you were trying to understand the total carbon impact of the building throughout its entire lifespan, embodied carbon is the other half of that equation. Now, depending on where you're at, the people always want to know what the ratio is between operational carbon emissions versus embodied carbon emissions. And the reality is it really depends on the magnitude of both of those. Obviously, it'll change the ratios, but also what region you're in, right? So, for example, in Vancouver, or in British Columbia, where we have relatively clean electricity supply, like we have a lot of hydroelectricity. And so the carbon emission factor, the carbon intensity of our electricity grid is relatively low, is actually quite low. The shift of balance between operational carbon emissions and embodied carbon is quite significant. So, in some of the newest projects where we've done a lot of work on decarbonizing and reducing operational carbon emissions, embodied carbon can be like 50%, sometimes even like 90% of the total impact over the lifespan. Now that doesn't generalize to every project in different regions. In Calgary, for example, where you're at, and that's where I was born, it's much higher carbon intensity of the electricity supply. So the ratios would change depending on where you're at. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think it's still, regardless, it's an important part to focus on, and in particular because embodied carbon, most of those emissions are upfront, so to speak. So they happen right when you're building the building, right? Like to construct the building, all the materials that go into the building, there's a lot of upfront emissions coming from the resource extraction, transportation, manufacturing, et cetera, right? And so if we can actually, from a climate change perspective, reduce those emissions right now, like there's a time value to the carbon emissions. And so reducing near-term emissions, you can think of as more important than reducing kind of future emissions, all else being equal, right? So, Yeah.
That's awesome. I was actually going to ask you for a definition of that, so that's perfect for that. So with all of the work, you're both working in the commercial space, consulting, helping various different projects with guidance on this. But you're also doing a lot of work in policy. I guess with your work in policy, what do you feel are some of the key elements that need to be considered in any policy framework? And what's kind of the mindset around approaching these?
Yeah, so I think first off, starting with disclosure is really important because that builds a lot of industry capacity. It's kind of easy to start off with. So, sorry, to back up a bit, if you're going to try to address embodied carbon in policy, and there's many different frameworks for how to do it, I think the key is first to set some target in the future as to where are we going? What type of reductions are we going to be requiring from a policy perspective? So for example, for the city of Vancouver, within their climate emergency action plan, they stated that, by 2030, we want to achieve a 40% reduction on embodied carbon emissions across the building sector. So that sets the bar. It's like 40% by 2030. Paired with that, they started off with disclosures initially through the rezoning submissions. So for all the projects that go through rezoning, which is about half of the new construction in the city, since 2017, they'd had to do disclosure. And that was actually the main impetus for even me starting up the company, the Priopta initially, because back then there's just, if you're just waiting on the voluntary certifications like LEED, where it's kind of an optional credit, there just wasn't many projects pursuing that at the time. But when you actually set that disclosure requirement within policy, within regulation, that drives a lot of projects. So it's not just kind of the shiny pilot projects, but or the projects with clients that really care, but it hits the vast majority of the projects, like every project, right? If you start with disclosure, that builds up a lot of the local industry capacity. So we've seen that in Vancouver, where a lot of the major firms now, like architectural firms, structural firms, even contractors, they're starting to kind of build in-house capacity and expertise around how to address this, right? So I think it's clear to kind of paint that roadmap and then have steps along the way. So what does it look like from now, disclosure, to 40%, for example?
Mm-hmm. So just to expand a little bit on the mandatory disclosure, are we talking about just any projects that fit a particular description? It's required to run an analysis on these projects and really just report what the impact is on this, just to kind of start building that capacity and building the I guess a base, like an inventory of projects so that we can set baselines.
Yeah, so it depends, obviously, where these, which policies we're talking about. Some policies only apply, for example, to federal buildings or government-related buildings. Some policies apply. In the case of Vancouver, I think we're probably the first one to put it into the building code and apply that to all projects, including private construction projects. So that's actually going into effect in July in Vancouver. So I think we're the first city to put it into the building code and required for all the building permit submissions. So in that case, yes, it's a disclosure and it applies to all the projects. And oftentimes when you do disclosure, that just starts the conversation going in many projects and among the design teams. So sometimes you actually get reductions just from that piece, whether or not it's reported or whether or not it actually is showing up. Yeah. Cool. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, that's great. Yeah. And with we were talking a lot about Vancouver, but we've got people listening from all around the world. You mentioned Calgary as well, and Calgary and Vancouver are great contrasts as far as as far as looking at operational and embodied carbon. So how would you approach regionally specific variations for any of these policy approaches?
Yeah. So if you were if there was the appetite to kind of develop policies, for example, and there may be depending, and that can vary depending on different regions, right? I think if you're going to try to achieve reductions, there's different pathways. So For example, this is something that we've contended with, in my work with the city of Vancouver, is like, what's the appropriate approach to doing this? Do you create a percent reduction relative to a baseline? Do you set some absolute threshold, like, certain kilogram of CO2 per meter squared, and just kind of go off of that? I think the ideal approach is to kind of marry both of them and have like an either or. So having a percent reduction or an absolute target. But that absolute target, you need to be very mindful with how you set that. And this ties into your question about like the regional variations too. So right now, so far, I feel like a lot of the efforts that I've seen in setting those absolute thresholds is kind of based on very crude data, or kind of very generalized, like it applies to all building types in all regions. And the reality is that there's a lot of specificity or differences between different regions. Like most importantly, concrete, right? The concrete supply in different regions is just different, right? And that affects the carbon intensity. And this is actually something that we see within Canada. Back then in 2017, we had one kind of industry average EPD for concrete, which was nationwide. And so everybody was comparing against that. Now, as of last year in 2022, they released provincially specific industry averages. And you can see there's big differences between the different provinces as like what is baseline, right? And so actually BC is like something like 30% lower than the old national average, right? And you can see those variations. So I think policies that are need to account for some of these nuances. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like it's not just regional variations, but also different project types. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's obviously many different types of buildings, and with many different types of structures and things that are feasible or typical practice, so to speak, for those. And so that's obviously going to drive the differences in materials and the associated carbon intensities associated with it, right? And also for certain project sites, for example, maybe you're located on poor soils, and so you need much more foundations, and so that's another factor. And just in general, there's many different factors that drive like the building massing and geometry, and so to account for all of those factors is sometimes very challenging to set one number that kind of maps to every single possible variation of building is challenging, which is why I think sometimes like marrying the two approaches helps. You want to be really intentional with setting that absolute target, and maybe it's like and you also have to think about like what's the right level of defining like what those different absolute thresholds are. So for example, do you want to define it for every different building archetype, or like how do you want to kind of split up these differences in the absolute targets? That's one thing. And ideally you want to set that threshold at a level that's definitely achievable, but it's also not like easy for every project to do. Because if it's easy, one thing I've seen is sometimes when that threshold is set too high, it just stops the conversation. Like if you set the threshold at like 500 and then like you do your first LCA on a project and it comes in at like 350, like the owner and clients are like, okay, well, we're done. Like we don't need to talk about this anymore, right? And so then like it just stops the conversation, which is one of the reasons why I have been an advocate for looking at that percent reduction approach, because you can kind of articulate where those reductions are coming from. So like the impact of every design decision that deviates from kind of typical practice. Like let's say you're sourcing lower carbon concrete. You can see what percent reduction you're driving from that relative to the industry average values. If you're doing material quantity reductions, it's specific to your building. So it kind of ties all the conversation specifically to that project, and it drives that conversation forward. And so from a policy perspective, these percent reductions, in a way, you're kind of driving those percent reductions on every project. But sometimes if you set that absolute threshold too high, it's just like a paperwork exercise for all the projects that easily comply with that. If you set it kind of like too low, there's some projects where it may be very challenging, maybe even not feasible to hit given the current material availability or access to low carbon materials. So I think it's a very nuanced thing that you have to be very intentional and careful about.
Something that comes up on a regular basis with just looking at the percentage improvement is really how do we set the baseline for that project? Like if we could set the baseline as the absolute worst possible project possible using the worst materials, and then set a say 15-20% improvement on that, which if we look at the overall project, that's not very good still. Like it's an
Totally.
improvement. So yeah, I can definitely see some of the challenges with that.
Well, actually, on that point, so because I've been working with the city of Vancouver and helping to develop these the city of Vancouver's embodied carbon guidelines, and a big part of that is how do you define the baseline for the purposes of the submissions to the city, right? And when I kind of worked with Patrick on developing kind of the initial draft of this, one of the things that I did was, as a practitioner, I came up with a giant list of all the ways that I could think of how to game a baseline. And then I was trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we actually give sufficient guidance to prevent the most egregious ways of gaming the baseline? How would you address all of that? And so that's the and this good document hasn't been published yet. Like we're still in a draft version, but it'll be published sometime in the next month or month and a half or so before the July code changes happen. But that's a key thing, is that I think we're providing a lot more guidance on how to define a baseline than historically has been given in approaches like LEED or different or zero carbon building standard with the CHBC, because historically there's just been kind of like the Wild West on how you define a baseline. Now, I'm not saying that like it's still a perfect fit solution. One of the challenges is also like there's a lot of differences between the different software tools. So one-click LCA is obviously one tool. There's also Tally. There's like Athena. There's newer versions of these tools kind of developing. There's EC3, TallyCat, which are not whole building LCA tools, but like they kind of tackle similar domains. So how do you design policy that works with that evolving landscape with all the different tools, which have different underlying data and sometimes modeling assumptions? So hopefully we're giving guidance to address some of the, how do you actually define a baseline? But there's definitely still some professional judgment involved there.
Yeah, and maybe we're early in this whole process for you to give a solid answer on this. But what are you finding, or how well are you finding this is working so far?
Well, I guess the policy hasn't been rolled out yet. So, but what we have been is like getting feedback from the industry on, for example, how we're on the guidelines, for example. I mean, on actual projects, like we've been applying this on some of our projects. We've done many whole building LCAs and we're advising many design teams. And I think that's been very helpful, is to actually really show those numbers, show those graphs to the design team and communicate really clearly to the architects or structural engineers, like what is the impact of this design decision? And we're like, where are the hotspots? Where should we focus efforts? And then how do we kind of systematically make sure that this makes its way into like the specs and actually drives design decisions? And so we've seen actual many different design decisions on projects actually shifted as a result of our work with them. And I think for each LCA, sometimes one of the ways that we look at it is it's not just about crunching the numbers. Like this is an opportunity to educate and raise awareness amongst all the different design team stakeholders. Some of them are more well-versed in this domain, some of them not. And so this is really an opportunity to kind of like bring everyone up to speed and on why it's important, what do the numbers mean, and what does it mean for this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with industry, you mentioned them. What kind of response do you feel like you're getting, especially in Vancouver, from the industry in general? Like, is it sort of pushback?
Like it's been very positive, actually. Really? I think people have been very, very engaged and actually ready for this. So I've seen like wide-ranging feedback from architects, from structural firms, from the material suppliers like the concrete industry, the wood industry, etc. Now that said, we still need to be really smart and thoughtful about how we design the policy and making sure that it doesn't add more burden to the design process or add a lot more fee or budget or construction delays or changes to like the permitting schedule, for example. So I think that there's things that we're working through right now to like make sure that it's a very streamlined process. Even things like how do you actually check the LCAs? What's the quality assurance process around that? I think there's solutions that can be developed on that. Actually, this is something that is very kind of top of mind for me right now. Is like, and I'm not saying that this is going to be the solution that's used everywhere, but this is something that we're developing internally, and hopefully this will be helpful for different jurisdictions or regions that are kind of developing these policies or groups that are mandating whole building LCAs. Is how do you actually do those checks? When you're getting whole building LCAs from many different consultants, from different tools, who's going to look through that? What's the quality assurance process look like? And I think the key is we really need to have automated quality assurance checks on these. That's the only way that I could see these policies scaling. Like most of these different groups that are like from a regulatory perspective, they don't have that deep expertise to kind of dig into the LCAs for everything, right? And so you need something. That's something that I'm kind of working on right now. Is like, how do you actually gather all the raw granular data in as much detail as possible with material quantities, with impact, all the GWP and all the other environmental impact categories, and how do you run checks on it in an automated fashion so that you can actually ensure the quality of it. And I think this is also going to be key from a policy perspective, whether you're doing a % reduction baseline or an absolute target. Like for an absolute target, one of the concerns, like I've seen some LCAs that are kind of atrocious where it's like, it's just 5 line items. It's like one wall, one roof, one floor, or whatever. And it's like, they just take the square footage. They don't really even factor in the geometry or anything like that. And, that LCA can spit out an absolute number, and it could probably be much lower than something that like goes really in depth into your Revit model and like gets detailed material quantities and is factoring in all these other elements that may be missing in this model. Both of them can produce an absolute number. One's probably lower, right? And so that's one of those nuances when you're setting these policies, is like, what's the quality assurance process? And if you can actually indicate to the market that there's going to be an automated quality assurance check in this process, then that also leads to higher quality submissions, and it ensures that like we can rely on these numbers more. And plus, if we're going to use those submissions for the purposes of benchmarking, we want to know that like what went into that. Like, how robust is this data, right?
You also mentioned like the feedback from the industry. Like a lot of people in Vancouver were really prepared for this. Do you think that's like was there something that really drove that? Was it good communication early on? Like what really drove that?
I think this goes back to that thing about like kind of disclosure early on. Like we're kind of maybe a little bit earlier on the journey, because like in 2017 this was included in the rezoning policy, right? So that was that disclosure requirement. So that's kind of much earlier than many other regions. And so I think this locally, the industry has had more time to kind of think through and prepare for this. But that said, yeah, I think having that clear progression of like not just the disclosure, but then like where are we going? That's an important factor. Now, I'm not saying that this is true every region, right? Obviously, Vancouver is like a very special place, and we have a really progressive building industry that has been leading the charge, not just on embodied carbon, but on passive house, on operational carbon, on all sorts of different fronts, right? So in a way, we're kind of building on that. But that said, I do see right now there's a lot of growing appetite, like all around. So I was recently at this Pacific Coast collaborative group, which was talking about policy, which convened policymakers from BC and basically along the West Coast. So like Washington, Oregon, California, and some of the leading cities there, right? And there was a lot of talk about how can we kind of collaborate? What type of policy frameworks do we want to look at? So these conversations are definitely happening, both at a material level, like through buy clean policy type approaches, and at a kind of a whole building level. And I guess right now, yeah, we're in that process of figuring out like what's the best practices. How do we kind of do this? How do we actually address some of the common concerns that might come up from implementing these policies? And so I think there's a lot of thoughtful people kind of working in this domain right now, and yeah, to address any of those that come up.
Yeah, and kind of on the ground, like a lot of this is policy, and it really ties in tightly with actual operations of this work. What would you say is the some of the biggest challenges with actually applying this on the project?
So from a practitioner perspective, or from the policy maker perspective?
Practitioner.
From the practitioner, well, I think a lot of people's perspectives of what's challenging or not challenging is very tied to the software tool that they use. And oftentimes people aren't very well versed in all the different tools that are out there, which all have very different strengths and weaknesses on that. And now this is obviously just talking about kind of the modeling aspect. I know the whole world is not just modeling. There's also like the practical realities of like, how do you actually implement this on projects? So broadly speaking, I think there's a class of challenges around like, what can we do with tools? What's the underlying data? How do we model this? And within that, how do you define baselines? I think that's often an area that people find challenging, or like how should we go about doing that? But modeling aside, I think there's the aspect of working with the actual design team, right? And depending on the different design team members or companies that are involved, some are further along in the journey, some are less so. And so this, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of an educational exercise. So a lot of this becomes communication, like how do you communicate to the stakeholders around like the impact of these decisions, and also figuring out at what point in the design process is each of these conversations appropriate, right? Certain conversations are appropriate earlier in the design process. Certain things happen like just prior to tender. And then like, how do you kind of follow through and make sure like getting into the specifications, what goes into that and whatnot, right? So I think there's a lot of nuances to that. And so it's kind of a big exercise for education for everyone, including like the LCA practitioners as they're going through this. But I think as we keep, as the industry builds up experience on this, like we'll start to figure out a lot of like kind of the best practices along these fronts.
Yeah, perfect. So I want to get kind of to the end, because I know we've got some questions we want to go through, but just the last couple. When you are performing LCAs from the from the practitioner perspective, what do you wish was available?
As a practitioner, what do I wish was available? I mean, I think right now, I would like to see open access, like open source LCA models for each of the underlying materials, which I think has flow through effects on like then open source kind of data or open access data, and having all of that kind of become standard practice and deployed across all the different software tools. I think one of the headaches right now is like each of the tools have different underlying databases and they spit out sometimes different numbers for a variety of reasons. And I would like to see a lot more harmonization between what's happening across the different tools. And I think part of that is like some of the underlying data is actually locked up in proprietary databases. So they need by necessity, they get rolled up when they're presented. And I think that's actually done a lot of harm in the industry. Like the reality is that people can read numbers, people can read graphs, they can figure out what's higher, what's lower. So why is there so much confusion in the industry? It's because there's actually been a lot of like proprietary data that's been locked up. And so as a result, the tools have had to roll up the results and kind of, so it's hard to disaggregate how much is coming from this material, from this assembly or whatnot, because they need to kind of protect that data. So I think we need some efforts to fund and ensure that that data actually is free and open access. That will then have a lot of downstream impacts into the whole ecosystem. You know, it's one thing to have EPDs widely available, but it's like a lot of it is like the underlying background data that feeds into the LCA models that then feeds into the production of these EPDs, and making all that open source and freely available, I think is key.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And last question: where do you see the industry going in 10 years? What's your forecast?
I mean, I think we can definitely already see, like I hear from many different people that are surprised at how quickly the action and focus on embodied carbon has happened, right? Like it's much faster than many people expected. I definitely see that continuing. I see like policies being implemented all around the world right now. And so I think definitely in 10 years, like we'll have policies on like in many important regions around this. The tools, the data, all these challenges that we're kind of dealing with right now, I think will get ironed out fairly quickly. And it becomes standard. I think ultimately we need to get to a place where what does it take to actually have this become standard practice on every single project, not just in North America or in Europe, but globally. And I think that's the kind of the North Star we need to think about. There's a lot of new construction happening beyond just North America and Europe. And we need to figure out how to address this and how to adapt to that, all those requirements. How do we actually get data for all the materials that are produced globally? And how do we kind of get that into a point where it actually influences the design decisions on every single project globally? I think that's the kind of the North Star is like, and also not just focusing on embodied carbon exclusively. We then need to also figure out, okay, how do we kind of marry this with the myriad of other considerations that people are dealing with, that design teams are dealing with? How do you tackle like climate resilience or biodiversity, or like, obviously operational carbon emissions, costs? There's all these different factors that design teams are kind of contending with. So like, not just making like the embodied carbon data widely available, but then how does that fit into this wider framework? Do we have like to make these decisions so that they're streamlined, straightforward, and like we're making the optimal decisions on every project everywhere globally. I mean, that's a big vision, but I think there's maybe we'll get some help from AI. Who knows?
Yeah, right. It'll just become more and more implemented, and just really helping with the decision making process.
Yeah.
Yenny, if you want to jump back in, I know we have a bunch of questions here. So I'll let you take the first one, and I'll jump in with the next.
Well, first of all, thank you both for such an interesting conversation. So now it's the time for Q&A. And we have a lot of good questions already. So let's see how many we can actually get covered. So let me start by a question that came from Tracy, and this was highly voted in the chat. So do you feel that we have sufficient data to start setting reasonable absolute whole life carbon global warming potential targets for residential and commercial buildings in North America? Do we have sufficient data?
I don't think right now we have. Well, I think we have enough data to have like a starting point, but I think we definitely need more robust data to really refine this, right? Like, and yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about different strategies for how to get there really quickly. Like, how do we actually set robust targets literally by the end of this year? What does that look like? What is that process? How do we kind of rapidly gather that data? And how do we kind of make a more informed decision around that? And also part of this goes into how we collect the data that I mentioned earlier. I think I was just on a call yesterday with some people talking about how can we actually harmonize the reporting procedure and the submission template for all the different projects globally. And this ties into that whole benchmarking thing. I think where some of the historical benchmarking efforts have been hamstrung is that we don't know what quality of data went into that, these LCA submissions. So we just kind of get some flat rolled up values. And sometimes we don't even know like what's the floor area definition that they use, that they divided the total emissions by. So you have a kilogram of CO2 per meter squared, and we don't know if that included parkade area or it didn't include underground parking, which affects the results a lot, right? So, there's all these issues, and I think a lot of this would get addressed and solved. This is kind of one thing that I would like to kind of push forward is and not just me, but other people, is having anybody that's requesting whole building LCAs, whether it's like folks like the city of Vancouver or city of Toronto or other regions, or like you're the US GBC, like for LEED or for zero carbon building standard or any other kind of green building rating system, ask for the raw data. Ask for like that default submission like spreadsheet with like row by row every material in the building, what's the material quantity, what's the impact. With that data, we can then clean that up and do a lot more robust quality assurance checks on it, but also that feeds into benchmarking efforts. You'll know like how this is split. I think one of the fallbacks of how these submission templates, because there's been a proliferation, many different groups are creating their own submission templates, and they fall into a typical pattern of like either they make it too simplistic and you just report the total values, but you have no granularity into like what the breakdown of emissions are, or they try to show that breakdown, but then they haven't thought through how that would be addressed from the different software tools as it's exported, right? Because all the different tools structure their data in a different way. And so it's kind of a whole harmonization exercise. And so that's the tension that's been built up. And what we really need to get to a point is like, just get that raw data. We can do so much with that. And from there, we can set much more robust absolute targets.
Fantastic. Hey, let's take second question. There's so many more to come.
I'll try to answer quickly. Sorry.
Sure.
All right. So next question is actually there's some 3 different sections to it, but let's take the first one here. So how do we communicate the outcomes of LCA to stakeholders inside, outside the boundary of the company?
Well, typically we actually, I'll just share like what we do internally. Like we've spent a lot of time developing resources and slides to that kind of tackle all different aspects of like how you can communicate around embodied carbon, but particularly around like the design decisions, like what can you do around concrete, what can you do around steel, what can you do around like insulation, etc. So showing the data, showing like and then how that applies to the results of the project. So then we've also developed a lot of our internal visualization tools that kind of parse through the results in even more granularity. So then we can kind of show very clearly, what went into the modeling, what the results are, so and what the impact of each decision is. So I think within that, it's like having a good slides to just kind of like present that information, and then you basically convene in a meeting with like the relevant stakeholders. So like if it's relevant for structural and envelope or architect and maybe the owner, you bring them together, maybe the contractor, depending on what phase you're in. You have those types of conversations, and then that then spearheads like the next steps. Okay, what do we need to do to get this into our specs or whatnot? And kind of doing that at certain intervals throughout the design process.
That sounds good. Hey, then let's take the second part of the question. So how do we integrate LCA through different processes in the company? That's the second step. Then after communicating, how do you integrate?
It really depends on like which company you're talking about, right? Are you an architect? Are you a structural engineer? Like each kind of consultant or stakeholder kind of has a different role to play on the project. And I think so that's kind of an open-ended question a little bit as to like what's appropriate for each company, like what's appropriate for a developer versus a structural versus an architect versus like some sustainability consultant, right? It's hard for me to kind of answer beyond that, but I think like there's a lot of work that's been done on like kind of creating these kind of diagrams like throughout the different design phases. What are the key design decisions that need to be made at each phase, and thinking about what's going to be relevant. And I'm sure we're going to see more resources specific to each discipline. So for example, I know like here locally, like the Engineers Geoscientists BC, the kind of the association, like they're working on a practice advisory guideline for structural engineers, right? And there's been many of these kind of discipline specific guidelines. And so I think I would kind of refer you to those types of, like AIA has some information for architects. So and as those resources get developed, like for different teams, like they should kind of look at those resources and think about, okay, how do we incorporate those best practices into our process?
Fantastic. I think
Danny, if I can jump in just a little bit, I have a little bit of a variation on the third part of that, and I guess with larger projects where you have multidisciplinary teams, do you have at Propt a kind of an approach that you like to use with navigating these projects? Like how do you have these different teams that have different components of the building, or different scopes of work together on comprehensive LCA work?
I mean, I think that's true on many of our projects where we have different consultants. So like sometimes there's a structural Revit model, there's an architectural Revit model. We have a lot of fun into like kind of mashing and figure out which ones have the accurate quantities, which ones we should which pieces we should take from which model, and then kind of do. So we kind of handle a lot of that, and then we go through the drawings and like cross-reference, go through like if there's cost quantity surveyor information, we'll factor in that information. So we try to like make sense of all that information in one place. So we kind of just request the relevant information, and then we kind of give that information, like the results, back to the design team. So I think that's been streamlined. Sometimes like if you're in a broader design team where it's like, sometimes it's not clear which consultant, let's say like there's no like LCA consultant on the project, or like kind of a specialized consultant. And it's like, so it's the architect, or maybe it's the structural engineer doing an LCA. Then sometimes it can be a bit of challenges to figure out like who should do what, like how do we gather that information from the relevant stakeholders. So I think it's a kind of an evolving thing, but at least internally, that's how we've kind of addressed this. Like just collect all the information from all the stakeholders that might be relevant. We parse out what's the best kind of data source for each element of a building or material of a building, and then we piece it all into one model.
All righty. Can we take a couple more questions?
Sure. Yeah.
So next one comes from Tim. So have you ever encountered an LCA that has included emissions from land use change during and after extraction?
This is really interesting. I just got into this conversation with Steph Carla like last week. I didn't realize, but I think in the UK, they're starting to look at this also for biogenic carbon, like separating out, like having a land use change category as well. I'm not too familiar with the specifics of it, but probably, yeah. In North America, no, I haven't seen that. I know that's an impact category. I know that's something that people are addressing. I haven't really seen what that looks like, but from what I've heard in the UK, or maybe it's in Europe in general, like there's been some conversation on that front. So I'd love to see where that goes. But yeah, I haven't seen it here.
All righty. I'm just looking at the time, but there are so many good ones still to come. So let's take
Happy
one.
to keep going.
Let me just keep going. So from David, is there any effort to create a national standard building focused maximum carbon intensity baseline, either nationally or globally?
So there's two pieces to that. National standard, yes, there have been efforts on that, and there are ongoing efforts. So like in Canada, National Research Council had developed the whole building LCA guideline. So that document's already published. In the States, I know like there's current efforts happening with ASHRAE 240p. So that's another standard that potentially can be referenced in code. Maybe that'll get published, I think, in 2 years, but they're on an accelerated timeline to try to get that standard up and running, but they're kind of in the early innings on that front. So there's definitely efforts on like creating these standards. Now, specific to like the maximum carbon intensity baseline, I don't know that that's the standards are typically addressing like how do you do the calculations and like what assumptions you use or how do you define like do the calculations for each life cycle stage or all those specifics. I think in terms of like what is the baseline or how do you kind of arrive at that, that's something else. And so that's an evolving area, I think, of like what is the best practice around it. There's different approaches to tackling that. But I don't know that we're going to get one globally. I think nationally, yes, potentially. But actually, I think it should be more regionally specific. That would be the ideal approach, rather than just have one number nationally.
All righty. Hey, let's take one more question from the audience. So let's take the one from Jack. So for a firm picking up a building secondhand, after construction and having an owner before, where does the responsibility for embodied carbon lie?
That's a good question. I've seen some resources, to be honest, like I've seen some resources on this recently, and I haven't just had the time to like dig through like what that means as to now. I mean, I think broadly speaking, I think if there's what you can control, like basically the existing buildings in a way like a sunk cost, right? From a practical perspective, what can you actually control? If you're doing a tenant improvement, all the new materials that are associated with that, that's definitely something that you can control. If you're doing demolition on like any parts of that, or like there's waste generated from, you know, maybe your tenant improvement process or something, maybe you want to expand the scope and start looking at some of those things as well, of like how you're handling that waste. But broadly speaking, that's kind of my first pass at an answer, but I know like there's a lot of efforts ongoing right now as to like, okay, how do you, you know, from an ESG perspective, how do you define this and where does it fit into the whole process, depending on what stakeholder, and how do you do the accounting and scope 3 and all that. So I haven't kind of dived too deep into that world. I've been sticking mainly in like the LCA world right now, but it's a good question. I think there are some answers out there. I haven't had a chance to dig through all of it.
All right. We need to pause the live Q&A here. This was fantastic. I think we could have spent the whole hour just going through these questions. So thank you everyone for being so active and posting so many questions. But we have some questions for Anthony as well, which we need to cover. So let's try to be quick. So last time we had Michaela joining this Carbon Experts Live, and she placed a question for you. And the question is, what is the simplest way we can lower the embodied carbon of our built environment? So what is the simplest way?
I mean, if you're going to focus on one thing, it's probably the concrete. Like, I think pretty much there's concrete on every project, if nothing else on the foundation. Maybe not every, but like almost every project. So I think looking at that tends to be typically one of the highest impact categories. So then what can you do on that concrete? So, you know, using Portland limestone cement instead of just regular Portland cement, that's kind of one low hanging fruit. If that's not already standard practice in your region, that's one thing. Then really optimizing on the supplementary cementitious materials, so fly ash or slag, optimizing the percentage there to displace the amount of cement used, which is where most of the emissions come from. Optimizing that for each building element. So maybe you can afford to go higher on SCMs, you know, maybe on your foundation, but maybe less so on your suspended slabs or on other elements. So really having a conversation with your structural engineer as to like, how do you optimize the concrete mix all across? Can you use 56-day mixes instead of 28-day mixes? All those types of conversations around concrete, I would say that's a good starting point.
So focus on concrete. That's a good starting point. Let's take the next question. So what recent change in the industry are you most excited about? We covered quite many things already, but if you would be to name one, what would it be?
I would say policy. I think the appetite for policy and in my view, that's that's the main driver. If you actually have policy or regulations in place, and the idea of like potentially bringing this stuff into the building code, right? Like that drives all this downstream stuff, because oftentimes people are like, oh, we need to have better data, we need to have better tools, we need to have this and this. Like the reality is that whole building LCA has been around for many, many years. Mostly people didn't care about it for a long time. The only reason people started caring about was that it started entering some of the policy conversations. Not the only reason, but that's one of the primary reasons. So then it drives all these parallel efforts like education, capacity building, tools, data, like all those kind of flow when you have that.
That makes perfect sense. So we get some speed into things. Then last question. If you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be? Not policy. What would be that other thing?
Well, I think making embodied carbon, like tackling embodied carbon, really optimizing for that on every project and making that standard practice globally. Like that's the, when I started CLF Vancouver, I remembered having the lofty goal of I was like, if this became standard practice within all the major design firms in North America in 2 years, like that's my goal. Like, can we kind of get there? And I remember talking to people that were like, that had been in the industry for decades, and they're like, you'd be lucky if that happened in 20 years. And to their surprise, it's like, it's happened. I don't think we've gotten quite to that goal yet, but at the same time, like it's come a lot faster and a lot further than people expected. But yeah, I think making that standard practice, and not just in North America and Europe, globally, that would be my wish.
That's an important wish. Then, hey, you can place one question for our next guest. So Helen will be joining next Carbon Experts Live. So what question would you like to ask her?
Well, I just in our conversation earlier, you mentioned Helen is based in Singapore and moving to Hong Kong, I believe. So, and in Hong Kong, I spent some time there talking to some of the folks in the local industry there too. And that's been a big question of mine as to like, how can we drive action on embodied carbon the fastest in that region? What does it look like? Is it policy, and is there room on the regulatory front? And maybe if it's not policy, like what other thing do you see as like kind of the main impetus? What should we focus on to kind of accelerate action in that region, in the Asia Pacific region, or maybe specific to Hong Kong if you think of it, or Singapore, for example?
That's a great question. So what's the fastest way? All right, so that's all for the questions. So now you can breathe again. So much good stuff that you shared. We have a couple of things just to kind of highlight for the attendees before we kind of finish for today. So in case anybody wants to learn more, so here's a couple of good kind of assets for you to have a look. So if you go to oneclicklca.com/library, there's some good assets and resources to go and have a look. There's also some free training opportunities coming up now during this summer. So there's now registration open for the next Building LCA Bootcamp. That's a free training, 5 days that OneClick LCA offers for everyone. So again, if you go to academy.oneclicklca.com, you find all the details and you can save your seat. Then very last reminder, if you want to get in touch with these two gentlemen, you can find their contact details here. Any other kind of preferences, how to be in touch or how to follow you, Anthony and Travis?
I think LinkedIn is probably the best way. I post stuff on there, and that's a good way of engaging. But yeah, feel free to contact me by email, for example, if you have questions or specific things.
Fantastic.
LinkedIn's great for me as well.
LinkedIn is great. All right, so LinkedIn followers, get in touch with Travis and Anthony for more questions, and those questions that we might not get to answer today. All right, then, like said, Helen will be joining next time. You can sign up and save your seat. Let's post some nice questions for Helen as well. And with this, I want to say thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, everybody joining today. Thanks for great questions once again. Let's reconnect next month. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks.